She smiled with that perfect, practiced grief smile, and told the room I was inconvenient. Then she laughed in front of a lawyer. "Hope you enjoy being homeless," she said under her breath, Rachel's voice, soft with satisfaction. I could feel the words like ice crawling down my back. The mahogany desk smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. Thomas Hale cleared his throat and reached into the folder on his lap. "There is one more provision," he said. "Mr. Langley added this recently." My hands were numb. The chair beneath me felt like a stage prop, real enough to support my weight, unreal enough to suggest I would wake up and this would be gone. The room tilted for a second and then steadied. I stared at Rachel, at the way her mascara flinched just slightly when the name I loved most echoed across that small office. Michael. The envelope slid across the desk like a pawn moved into place. Thomas opened it carefully, as if it held an instrument fragile enough to break a life. The words inside would change everything. They already had. The phone rang in the middle of the night like an intruder. At first I thought it was a televangelist with another crusade or an unknown number hawking short-term loans. I fumbled for the bedside light and saw Michael's name flash across the screen. My chest dropped cold. "Mom," his voice said, ragged and foreign. "I'm at work. I think my chest, I can't breathe." The rest is a blur of fluorescent lights and asterisks on a chart. The ER moved with mechanical competence. People in scrubs said words like "arrived with no pulse" and "ischemic," with the same tone they might use to order lunch. I remember a doctor saying he was 43 and in the wrong place for this sort of thing. "Massive heart attack," she said. The world narrowed to the sound of my own breathing and the hollow echo of a life that was not ending the way it should. I arrived at the hospital in the kind of time that bends physics. Too late, too fast. There was Stephanie. No, not Stephanie. That was not her name. Rachel stood at the end of the hall, hands clasped so tight the knuckles showed white in the fluorescent hum. She blinked once, then twice. A kindness took the place of a crack I hadn't noticed. Relief. People grieve in ways that don't always make sense. I told myself this. I found myself reaching for explanations, for a narrative that would soften the sharpness of the moment. But grief is not polite. It reveals. It tears things apart that had been sewn over with the daily rhythms of life. When Michael was gone, so too went whatever fragile truce existed between Rachel and me. "Now we deal with reality," she said to me later in the sterile waiting room. Her voice had gone flat and clinical in the space of a single sentence. "We need to sort things." A tremor of dread ran through me. If I had sketched our life in thin pencil lines, you'd see an outline of cohabitation and restraint rather than connection. I had moved in with Michael and Rachel 2 years earlier after selling my small townhouse. It had seemed in the beginning like a temporary kindness: share expenses, help keep the house tidy, be near my only son while his job demanded long hours. Michael promised me, "Just until you get something smaller, Mom." The word "until" has a way of stretching until it becomes permanent. Rachel was efficient in the way that leaves little room for sentiment. She kept lists, color-coded, temperamentally organized, and she removed photos like a conservationist stripping a house for renovation, photographs that showed a living mother and son growing together quietly over time. I had learned to skirt my edges in that home to avoid being a nuisance. I cooked, I managed appointments, I ran errands. I did not argue over decorating choices or the new lamp on the mantel. I did, however, notice the small changes, the way my name was not on shared accounts, the way my late-night phone calls went unanswered. It would have been easy to chalk some of it up to life, to busy schedules and different personalities, but other things landed heavier. I had given them $40,000 5 years earlier to help with the down payment on their home. Michael insisted it was just to get them started, but he also told me it was family helping family. I believed it, perhaps because I wanted to. That money had been the last of a nest egg I had guarded for years. I had expected, in return, some measure of dignity, maybe a small place at the kitchen table when I wanted to talk. Instead, the house eventually felt less like shelter and more like a contract I had never signed. 2 days after Michael's funeral, Rachel said, plainly and without the sheen of apology, "You need to go. We'll sort out the house." The words left me with the taste of gravel. By 6 in the evening, I had packed what could be folded and stored in suitcases. I packed photograph albums last. I did not want to leave those behind to be sifted through by anyone who might choose to reframe our past to suit a new narrative. Rachel stood at the doorway with her arms clasped so tight the knuckles showed white in the fluorescent hum. She blinked once, then twice. A kindness took the place of a crack I hadn't noticed. Relief. I watched the car taillights until they blinked out of sight and drove to the nearest motel with a plastered sign that read vacancy. The room smelled of bleach and stale perfume, and the TV displayed a static weather forecast. I lay awake thinking of Michael, his laugh, his small acts of care, the way he'd always bring me a tea on bleak days, and also of the quiet ledger that he had kept that I didn't know about yet. Grief is a demanding companion, but it is not the same as helplessness. As the week passed, I used evenings to search for modest rentals. I petitioned my pension to make the numbers add up. I reminded myself that I had managed as a single woman for decades, that the current humiliation was only a chapter, not a definition. Then Thomas Hale called. He was my son's lawyer, a man with soft eyes and the sort of grammar that suggested a belief in fairness. "There will be a reading," he said, "next Tuesday at 2. I should have heard only the appointment, but the sentence carried with it a new shape, one of possibility. The waiting room at Hale and Partners smelled faintly of coffee and leather. Rachel arrived in a dress that seemed to announce she had nowhere left to appear shy. She brought Aaron, her brother, who took notes like a man cataloging evidence against an imagined adversary. They sat like possession claims at a family estate auction. Thomas read with measured cadence at first, the house, the cars, the retirement accounts, the life insurance, all going to Rachel. I listened to my own name in quiet places. The name the man had used for me was not as dismissive as Rachel was. "There is a final provision," he said, and the air changed. He read the clause aloud. "Clara Bennett is to receive access to safety deposit box C291 at First National, along with all associated documentation and instructions." We all paused as if someone had struck a bell. Rachel's reaction was immediate and vocal. "What's in that box?" she demanded. "Why would Michael do that?" Thomas flipped a page and continued. "The deceased provided the bank details and a sealed envelope which Mrs. Bennett may open after the bank completes its verification process. The bank requires 3 business days to process paperwork. The contents are to be made available to Mrs. Bennett alone." Her face went gray with a new calculus. She rose to leave and then stopped, like a runner who knows the finish line is not quite in reach. "We'll contest it," she said into the smallness between us, and led Aaron out into the sunlight. First National's vault seemed to exist in a different era. Iron gates, hollow footsteps that echoed as if the building remembered everything it had been. Mrs. Caldwell, the bank manager, was courteous and professional. Her manner was trimmed like a uniform. She escorted me to a private room where the box would be opened. The deposit box swung open with a thunk that felt heavy in the chest. Inside lay a single manila folder, a small, weary-looking journal, and a sealed envelope with my name. Michael's handwriting, his tilt, his small way he dotted his I's, felt like the last warm thing in the cold room. "If you're reading this, then I am gone, and I'm so sorry. But I'm not surprised if Rachel has shown you who she is. I've been keeping this for years, Mom, not to punish her, to protect you." There were bank statements, investment account summaries, printed copies of emails and texts, and a document labeled Chronicle. Michael had been meticulous in a way that came from a place of quiet, devoted fear. He had tracked payments, annotated wires to the mortgage, and saved chats that revealed more than the exchanges themselves.
intentions, patterns, the quiet calculus of a woman planning a life around someone else's money. The balance pages were the first shock. What had been $40,000 invested and compounded had grown, with careful stewardship, into a sum that would make a late-life rebuilding possible, a nest egg that could buy independence rather than a week's motel. As I sat in that little bank room, the world rearranged itself. Michael had not been careless. He had not been naive. He had been, in his last years, deliberate and loving in ways that mattered. Rachel called 2 hours after I left the bank, as calmly as someone offering afternoon coffee. "Could you come by for lunch?" she asked. "I think we should talk about the box." Her tone suggested negotiation. Her family sense suggested performance. I accepted it because it was a chance to look her in the eye when I was no longer the woman she thought she could push around. She answered the bore in a white dress, smiling with the currency of someone who felt secure in their holdings. The table was set with china and a casual sort of opulence that suggested practice at living well. Lunch was pleasant on the surface, talk of trivialities, of weather, of small condolences offered like sugar and tea. Then she asked flatly, "So what did Michael leave you?" I placed the folder on the table. The room warmed by degrees as she read, but couldn't look away. There were emails that showed a decision-making pattern by Rachel and Aaron. There were credit card statements showing charges for weekends in the city and brand-name purchases. There were notes indicating Rachel had, on multiple occasions, proposed ways to limit my influence in the house. Representations that read like the minutes of a plan. Rachel's hands trembled by the time she reached the page that detailed mortgage payments coming directly from Michael's payroll. The arithmetic was simple. A deniable generosity on his part, a concealed independence on mine. "This is a violation of privacy," she yelled at me at one point. "No, it's a record of a man's love, of his concern. He wanted to make sure I would be all right when the time came. No more, no less." I looked at her. "Do not speak to me like I'm a thing to be divided." The words landed. The mask cracked. She gave me an apology so thin it would have been comical if not for the context. "I didn't mean it," she said. "I shouldn't have been cruel." We both knew she meant every cruel thing she had ever said. Rachel shifted tactics. She started talking about stewardship and responsibility, about how she could be the better manager of both our futures if I would simply cede a portion. "We can manage this together," she said. "You won't have to worry about a thing." The offer smelled like smoke. She suggested pooling Michael's private savings with his life insurance and her investments, then hiring a financial advisor who would, naturally, be one of her contacts. She spoke of diversification in bonds and the dangers of making emotional choices with large sums. "You could do so much," she added, but the subtext was unmistakable. She intended to shape so much into something that fit a life she had already designed without me. I told her I wanted none of it. I explained calmly that the money in those accounts was not a gift, but the result of an agreement, one I expected to honor in spirit and in law, to protect my interest, to ensure my independence. Michael had given me that protection. I did not intend to ask permission. That afternoon, her breath quickened and her voice took on the pleading of a person whose plan had been caught in a net. "What do you want then?" she asked. "What is acceptable?" "I want to live on my own terms," I said simply. "I want the dignity of a house I can call mine, not the charity of a woman who measured me and found me wanting." She laughed then, a sound like someone attempting levity and failing. "You don't deserve it," she whispered. "You never did." The larger shock was not simply that Michael had left money. It was the ledger itself. 5 years of subtle notes, every card, every wire transfer, every offhand comment that suddenly assembled into a mosaic of Rachel's pattern. There was an email exchange where Rachel had discussed the optics of having her mother-in-law live with them. There were texts to Aaron referring to me as a useful inconvenience, and a thread in which they speculated about what would happen when Michael finally left the picture. The documentation was both mundane and devastating. Receipts for expensive dinners, charges for dresses, spa visits on days when groceries were scarce. Michael had annotated the margins with dates and small, patient notes. Paid by payroll deposit. She thinks it's a gift. Told Mom it was a loan. He had not been a vengeful man. That was not his nature. He had been protective.
And in the ledger's careful hand, his love looked like a plan. As I read those pages late into the night in my motel room, the path forward seemed less like revenge and more like reclamation. In the weeks that followed, Rachel tried to weaponize sympathy. She told neighbors that I had been difficult, that my presence had complicated a young couple's marriage. She implied I had been freeloading, a person who expected others to tend to her needs. But her voice in the neighborhood was not unanimous. Some people who had known Michael saw the tension and took my side. Others, impressed by Rachel's poise, fell in line. Aaron filed a motion to contest the will. Thomas Hale responded with the calm reserve of a man who had handled grief and temper. He counseled patience. The law is clear when instructions are explicit. A provision for a safety deposit box and a directive to the bank are difficult to reverse without clear evidence of incapacity or undue influence. It was a legal curtain I was glad existed. It meant that the ledger would stand as more than just a moral indictment. It might become part of an official record. Rachel, faced with the slow churn of legal procedures, grew desperate. She staged scenes of fragility in front of neighbors and attempted to show herself as the reasonable widow unfairly beset by a vindictive mother. She called people from Michael's past and attempted to shape the narrative with well-timed calls and carefully curated anecdotes. It did not always work. The more she tried to spin, the more holes appeared in the story. One evening, Rachel confronted me in the parking lot of the grocery store. Her eyes were bright, sharp, with a kind of desperation I recognized. "You should be grateful," she said. "Everyone knows what I've done for this family. You should be happy with a token." I looked at her and saw the fracture. "This is not about gratitude," I said. "This is about fairness." She lunged at me, figuratively, demanding that I sign a document that would surrender half of what Michael had set aside to her. "You can't live alone, Clara. Who will look after you?" I told her something hard, an honest thing. Michael looked after me, and he left instructions to make sure I could stand on my own. He knew what this might become. I'm not asking for favors. I'm reclaiming what is my own. She called me a selfish old woman. She used words like parasitic and embarrassing. She attempted to denigrate my life until I looked small, but the ledger had already spoken louder than she could. Tabloids did not show up for this story, but the backyard of suburban conversation felt like a stage. Rachel visited a local church group and implied I had been an intruder in the family I had given myself to. Some of their members nodded at her story, but a neighbor, a woman named Gloria, stood up and told a quiet, truthful anecdote about a Sunday afternoon when Michael had brought me to help with a garden and had insisted I sleep in the spare room because I loved the old house's creak. Small votes of confidence like that mounted. People who had seen kindness in small slices began to assemble pattern recognition. They told friends. Friends told acquaintances. The narrative fractured. When Aaron's legal challenge failed to find substantiation for undue influence, Rachel's repertory shifted again. She started to search for leverage in my past, a scandal to tarnish me with. She found nothing. The life I'd lived was not glamorous or scandalous. It was quiet work, paid for in small kindnesses and long winters. Even that could not be weaponized successfully. It was a weekday and a gray one, the kind that sits heavy in the chest and asks for reflection. I had returned to the house to pick up a few things: books, a teapot, a framed photograph, small sensible things that would fit into the new life I was building. Rachel was waiting in the kitchen like a nursery rhyme villain who'd moved from stage to reality. She started with entitlement. "You could sign one document and we could all be friends." "I won't sign my life away," I answered. The conversation dissolved into shouting. She accused me of theft, of lying about the $40,000, of being opportunistic. I told her I had documentation. She told me she would destroy it. The old contempt she nursed towards me had been replaced by panic. In the scuffle, she knocked over a vase. Glass shards glittered like tiny accusations on the hardwood floor. Aaron was yelling. The neighbors were peering through blinds. The scene could have been a melodrama, but it felt real and raw. That's when I did something I had not planned. I reached into my purse and took out one sheet, a bank summary Michael had printed and annotated. I placed it on the counter between us. "This is not about money," I said. "It's about how you underestimated what Michael would do." She lunged for the papers. I stepped back.
I was calm in a way that surprised me, as if a new person had moved into the house of my skin. "If you want to know why he left this to me," I said, "look at your own texts." I turned the screen of my phone and opened the images of messages Michael had saved. They were not flattering. They were not even kind. They were, to his credit, precise.
She stammered and tried to snatch the phone, but with the neighbors watching, she was careful. She had to be. People have a way of policing what they witness. "You can't scream me down," I said. "Not anymore. Not when there's a ledger that remembers for you." In the aftermath of the kitchen argument, Rachel retreated into a version of herself that seemed to think time and silence might heal what was a legal and moral wound. She made a show of being the wronged widow and occasionally visited the memorial at the church, hugging her father, smiling for the camera when friends asked. I used the money Michael had left to secure a small townhouse in a quiet part of town. It was modest, but mine. I painted the walls a color I'd loved as a young woman, a soft blue that reminded me of summers by the lake. I bought a proper teapot. I planted a small rosemary bush on a windowsill. It felt like not revenge, but like reassembling a life that had been paused. Rachel's anger did not fade. It rechanneled into lawsuits, into public insinuations, into the kind of small cruelty that wears on the edges of people. She hired a lawyer, willing to pursue the technicalities. She trotted out friends at depositions who could remember a snide remark or an awkward Thanksgiving. But the ledger was relentless. Michael's evidence was detailed and mundane, and honesty has a way of stripping maneuvering away. He had not left a note to shame her. He had left a record. Dates, receipts, a careful accounting of kindnesses misread as weakness. The evidence did not prove malice, it showed pattern, and then it showed the man who had anticipated that pattern. The judge in the probate hearing read Michael's notes, and with a procedural brush, found no basis for voiding the safe deposit box provision. Rachel's credibility frayed. People do not always see themselves as villains, but sometimes their behavior becomes visible enough to others that the mirror can't be denied. Months passed. The public drama dissolved into the ordinary tedium of living. Rachel still shopped and smiled, but a certain emptiness followed her like an old coat. She made increasingly frequent phone calls to Aaron, who now seemed less an ally and more a convenient resource when things needed a second opinion. As for me, I took evening classes in watercolor and learned to make my own bread. I began volunteering at a small literacy program where men and women who had missed the chance for college came to read in the evenings. Gardening became my new ritual. I found friends in unexpected places and a sense of stature that had nothing to do with bank balances. There was no gloating on my part. I had no appetite for spectacle. I had a ledger, yes, but the true gift was the knowledge of my son's careful love. One afternoon, in the warmth of a late spring afternoon, I received a plain envelope from Michael's old lawyer. Inside was a note in Thomas Hale's tidy hand and a copy of a letter Michael had asked Thomas to deliver if anything happened. The letter read in part, "I did not want to hurt Rachel. I simply could not stand by and watch her treat you as if you were an appendage to be discarded. I wanted you to be safe." Michael's words were as steady as ever. Outside, a robin sang on my windowsill. The rosemary on the sill smelled pungent and hopeful. I sat at my small kitchen table, stamped envelope beside the teapot, and thought of my son. There are things a child does that we do not always understand until we already miss them. In the quiet that followed, I closed my eyes and felt the slow, steady weaving of a life mended back together.